The invoice I handed them was for $34,800. They laughed at it. The site foreman actually folded it in half and tossed it back at me like it was a flyer for a pizza place. He said, and I'm quoting here, "Good luck with that, buddy." That was a Tuesday. By Friday, their lawyers had called mine 3 times. I need to back up about 8 months. I own 34 acres of land in the hill country outside Fredericksburg, Texas. Mixed terrain, part open pasture, part old cedar and live oak woods that run along the back third of the property. I bought it 11 years ago when the land was still just land. No structures, no utilities run to it. I put up a small house on the front portion, dug a rainwater collection system, and left the wooded section entirely alone. That was always the plan. A working buffer. Quiet. Nothing happening back there except deer trails and the occasional hawk. The boundary fence is cedar post and barbed wire. Old but solid. My neighbor to the east, a cattle rancher named Harlan, has land that runs parallel to mine for about a quarter mile. We've always gotten along fine. The kind of neighbors who wave from a distance and ask about each other's rain gauge totals. Never had a single issue in 11 years. Then, Harlan sold. He didn't call me before he did it. I found out the way you find out about most things in a rural county. Someone at the feed store mentioned it. New buyers were a land development company out of Austin. I looked them up that evening. Boutique residential development, mostly large lot communities. Their website had photos of stone entry gates and winding paved roads through cedar trees. I noticed that and filed it away in the back of my mind without quite knowing why. About 6 weeks later, a man in a white hard hat knocked on my front gate.
His name was Preston, project manager for the development company. Early 40s, clipboard, company polo shirt. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and a kind of professional warmth that I'd later understand was rehearsed. He explained that the company was planning a residential community on Harlan's former land, 18 lots, large acreage each, high-end custom homes. The access road to the development would come in from the county road on Harlan's east side. But there was a complication. The topography on that eastern edge was rough. A limestone escarpment ran along it that would require significant grading and a costly retaining structure to build a road through. The western approach, he said, would be much simpler. I waited. The western approach, he explained, would require crossing approximately 200 feet of my wooded property. I didn't say anything immediately. I just looked at him. He kept going. The crossing would be gravel road, maybe 14 feet wide. Construction would take 6 to 8 weeks. The company would restore any disturbed vegetation afterward. And he handed me a 1-page offer sheet, $8,000 for a permanent easement across that strip of my woods. I told him I'd think about it. I thought about it for about 4 days. I walked the wooded section twice, looking at the specific area they were talking about. It was the narrowest part of my property, a natural gap between 2 cedar thickets where the ground ran flat. I understood why they wanted it. It was the obvious path. I also knew that a permanent easement meant that road would be there forever. Future owners, future traffic, future disputes. $8,000 for forever felt like a strange trade. I called Preston and told him I wasn't interested in a permanent easement, but I was open to a limited construction license, a short-term agreement letting them use the corridor during the build phase, with a clear end date, full restoration requirements, and compensation closer to the actual value of what they were asking. I mentioned a number, $40,000 for the construction period, with a $500 per day penalty for any overrun past the agreed completion date. There was a pause on the phone. Preston said he'd take it back to the team. 3 weeks passed. No call. Then, one morning in late October, I was walking my perimeter fence, something I do a couple times a month, just habit, and I found it. A section of my barbed wire fence, about 12 feet wide, had been cut clean. The posts were still there. The wire had been unhooked from them and folded back, almost neatly, like someone had done it carefully and quickly. And on the other side, pressed into the soft caliche soil of my woods, were tire tracks, wide ones, the kind a loaded dump truck makes. I stood there for a while, not saying anything, because there was nobody to say anything to, just me and the cedar trees and a gap in my fence that hadn't been there a week ago. I took photos. Then I drove round to the county road and turned on to what had been Harlan's entrance. About a quarter-mile in, I could see where the new road was being graded. Heavy equipment, workers, a steady procession of trucks hauling fill material, and the route they were using to move that material, I could trace it by the ruts in the pasture, ran directly toward the gap in my fence. They hadn't called back. They hadn't negotiated. They'd just gone ahead and used my property anyway. I drove home and called my attorney. Her name is Sandra. She's been handling rural land matters in this county for close to 30 years. When I told her what I'd found, she asked me to send the photos immediately. I did. She called back within the hour. "Okay," she said. "Here's what I want you to do right now, today, before anything else. Go out to that gap in your fence and post it." I asked what she meant. "No trespassing signs. Every few feet along your fence line and directly at the gap. Dated photographs of each sign going up. Then I'm going to send a certified letter to the development company today telling them they are currently trespassing on your property and that continued use will result in legal action." I did all of that afternoon. Red and white no trespassing signs, photographs of each one, timestamp on every shot. Sandra sent the letter by end of day. The next morning, I drove out to check the gap. Fresh tracks. They'd come through again overnight. I called Sandra. She wasn't surprised. She said, "They're betting that you won't move fast enough, or that the cost of litigation will make you settle for whatever they originally offered." I thought about that for a moment. Then I asked her a question that I'd been turning over since the previous evening, when I'd been sitting at my kitchen table working out numbers on a scratch pad.
Under Texas law, when someone trespasses on your land and extracts commercial benefit from it, uses it as part of a revenue-generating operation, you have a right to seek what's called a reasonable use fee. Not just damages for the trespass itself, but compensation equivalent to what you would have charged had they asked permission. The measure isn't what you lost, it's what the use was worth. Sandra walked me through the math. The development company had 18 lots planned. Average sales price in that market, given the product they were building, was somewhere north of $800,000 per lot. Gross revenue potential of the project, somewhere between $14 and $16 million. The road access across my property wasn't incidental to that project. It was structurally enabling. Without it, they faced a significantly more expensive eastern route that would eat into their margins on every lot. The value of what they were using wasn't $8,000. It wasn't even $40,000. What they were using, without asking, was a load-bearing piece of a multi-million-dollar development. "So how do we document the use?" I asked. Sandra had a contact, a traffic engineer who did commercial road studies. He could install automated vehicle counters at the gap in my fence, small units bolted to the fence posts, completely legal on my property. They would count and classify every vehicle that passed through: passenger cars, light trucks, heavy trucks, log timestamps, direction of travel, axle configurations. I had them installed within the week. Over the next 6 weeks, those counters logged 847 vehicle passages through the gap in my fence. Of those, 312 were classified as heavy commercial, loaded dump trucks and construction vehicles. Based on the haul distances involved and the prevailing commercial rate for road use agreements in this county, Sandra's team calculated a reasonable use fee of $34,800. I put that number in a formal invoice on letterhead. Payment terms, net 30. I attached the vehicle count logs, timestamps, and a 2-page summary of the applicable statutes. I drove to the job site, found the site foreman, a stocky guy named Dale who'd been directing trucks through my gap like he owned the place, and handed him the package. He looked at the top page, read the number, looked up at me. Then he laughed, folded the invoice in half, and handed it back. "Good luck with that, buddy." I took the invoice back without saying anything. Drove home, called Sandra. She filed in district court the following morning: trespass, unjust enrichment, and a request for a temporary injunction blocking further use of my property until the matter was resolved.
The injunction request is the part that changes the temperature of a situation very quickly, because it asks a judge to order them to stop immediately while the case is pending. In a construction project with a delivery schedule and buyer contracts, a court-ordered work stoppage isn't an inconvenience, it's potentially catastrophic.
The development company's attorneys called Sandra's office that Friday afternoon. They wanted to talk. The conversation lasted about 40 minutes. I wasn't on the call, but Sandra briefed me afterward. The company's position had shifted entirely. They acknowledged the unauthorized use. They were prepared to resolve the matter financially. They did not want an injunction. What they offered was $52,000, the $34,800 in use fees, plus an additional amount described in the settlement language as goodwill compensation for disruption to property enjoyment. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't surprised by that number. I had been prepared for a long fight over the original invoice. What I got instead was a check that cleared within 10 business days. They also, as part of the settlement, agreed to repair the fence gap to my specifications, using materials and a contractor of my choosing. That work took about a day and a half. The cedar posts are stouter than what was there before. The barbed wire is tighter. The development company completed their project using a modified eastern route. I heard it ended up costing them somewhere around $90,000 in additional grading and retaining work, more than twice what they'd originally offered me for the easement. I don't know if that's exactly right, but I do know the math on turning down the negotiation and trespassing instead didn't work out the way they planned.